Welcome to Farmers Inside Track, South Africa's most downloaded farmers podcast and winner of the 2024 One IFRA Award for the world's best news podcast. I'm Duncan Masiwa. In the first episode of our series on APSA's Spring 2025 Agri-Trends Report, we unpack rising US tariffs and the global uncertainty putting pressure on South African exporters. My colleague Ivor Price led the discussion with APSA economists Selo Sekele, Zalma Sangweni and Kensani Mashimbi. Let's listen.
I would just say that the industry is not taking this laying down. They are moving quite nimble and are proving to be resilient.
And it's the one thing that South Africans are known for, There's even that expression, a farmer makes a plan, a boer maak 'n plan. It reminds me of that vasbyt factor, the resilient factor. So the spring edition of APSA's Agri-Trends Report has just been released, and it comes to no surprise that markets have been shaken up, especially following President Donald Trump's controversial tariffs. And today we'll be unpacking some of these trends shaping South African agriculture and beyond. And I'm joined by some of APSA's top economists. Thanks for your time. Selo, maybe we kick off with you and a bit of a macroeconomic perspective. Can you give us a sense of the global economic picture, the recent tariffs announcements, the T word? How has that been playing out?
Yeah, so maybe just to give context there. So the global economy right now is quite uncertain, right? So amongst other things, the main issue that people are talking about today is tariffs, and that's why we're here. So, in terms of what we've seen in that space, early April, Mr. Trump announced tariffs. I think it was 10% minimum tariff to all goods that are or most goods that go into the US, and reciprocal tariffs for those countries which the US has a big trade deficit with. And then later in the month, in April, beginning of May, most countries were given a reprieve. And then in that reprieve period, some countries were able to strike a trade deal with the US, and some didn't, including us. So that's the context when it comes to tariffs. What's interesting is that around April, we saw the IMF, coming out to say, look, guys, we think that these tariffs, on top of the rising geopolitical issues, are going to weigh on global trade as well as global growth. And at the back of that, they penciled in average economic growth, global economic growth of around 2.9% for this and next year. And this is down from the 3.3 that we saw in 2024. In the latest edition that they published around July, there they actually revised global growth higher by 0.2 percentage points on average for this and next year. So what that goes to show is that it looks like the global economy is actually dealing with these tariffs much better than was initially feared. So what does this mean for SA, right? So for SA, the US is important, okay? The US is our second biggest trading partner, and in terms of the value of exports that we took to the US in 2024, it's at the tune of around 15 billion US dollars. So that's not nothing, right? So when it comes to the calculus of what these tariffs mean for SA, so think of AGOA. So under AGOA, which has been in place from around 2000, the average tariffs on a trade-weighted basis was just around 0.7%, right? So under the new regime, where we as SA, couldn't find common ground with the US, we're now paying around, let's say, 15%. Okay, so that's that's a very significant impact, and it warrants this sort of discussion. If you want to put numbers in terms of the potential impact this will have on the South African economy, we as ABSA calculate that a 20% decline in exports that go to the US will take about 0.4% of GDP. So that those are serious numbers, right? And when you look at the kind of goods that are exposed to the US, it's mainly precious metals and stones, as well as automobiles. And although from a sectorial point of view, especially from where I sit as a macro economist, the US is not that significant of a trade partner for some sectors, but it's quite important for those goods that fall, for example, in the agricultural sector.
The numbers you're mentioning are quite staggering, and I remember just about a year ago when we had this discussion and Donald Trump was just coming to power, and we were so uncertain about how it was going to play out. And I hear the macro view. What does it look like in South Africa, and particularly the agricultural sector, Kenzie?
Sure, Iva, I remember that time we used to have Trump Tuesdays.
Yeah.
And then it became quite rapid with the ramping up of the Liberation Day tariffs to a daily discussion. So it does seem that for the agriculture industry, when you look at it from a macroeconomic view, you see that the portion that as the total agriculture sector, which is export orientated. So what we export to the global economy, 4% of that is what goes to the US. When you look at the number, it does seem quite insignificant, but what makes that number quite important is that the exposure there, it's quite regional, it's regionalized to the Western Cape and Northern Cape because of the characteristics of fruit that is taken to the US, and also concentrated in some sectors, predominantly nut, citrus, and table grapes. But if we zoom into citrus, you look at us as a Southern Hemisphere player. If we are charged a 30% tariff, that really undermines our relative competitiveness, because we enter the markets with the likes of Peru and Chile, who are being charged a much lower rate at 10%. So that really undermines how much we can derive from that trade in the US, and has really become a center of discussion for us.
And if we're using words like undermine, it seems like the tariffs have really uprooted South African agriculture. That's just my view. I'm not an economist like the rest of you. But how has the agricultural landscape changed following the implementation of these US tariffs, Zama?
Thanks, Ivo. I think we've been quite proactive, particularly from a government perspective as well as industry stakeholders. So some strategies involve negotiating with the USA. I think we started to show this effort when the tariff announcements came into effect in April. By not imposing a reciprocal tariff, that is an action and a sign to say that we are open for negotiation. I think within the negotiation spectrum, the fact that we did do a diplomatic visit in May, President Cyril Ramaphosa with some delegates went to go visit President Donald Trump. That is also a sign to say we are willing to sit down on the table and have some talks. And I think now ongoing are still talks as well. There is a proposal that has been reviewed, that is being shared with the USA. I think very active government individuals such as the Minister of Agriculture as well as the Trade Minister are working very hard and tirelessly to make sure that we are constantly engaging the USA in order to make sure that the situation does become better for South Africa. But I think, secondly, we've also had to look at other strategies, right? Diversifying to see where we can move some of the product that might not make it to the US markets, especially after August, when tariffs came into effect. And the diversification strategy has two pillars, right? I like to look at it in form of market expansion as well as market penetration. So with expansion, you already exist in those markets. You're a player in there. You already have market share. And then there is some room to sort of negotiate with your buyers to say, can you take some more product in this season, or whilst we are still facing this tariff challenge? But market penetration is rather a different conversation, right? That is entering a brand new market, a market we don't have significant market share in. We're not a dominant player. So if you consider what South African, like Kenzie has alluded to, it's a very important example in this space when it comes to tariffs. If you consider the amount of marketing effort, market share, establishing themselves in the USA and trying to divert that to another market, it's quite an unfair suggestion to make, because it takes years, it takes time. You have to understand consumer preferences of the market that you're entering. And if we're using long-term crops as an example, then you do know that it does take, for instance, if you're looking at citrus trees, it takes about a minimum of 4 years to grow the tree. So how do you then, within one season, try to align with consumer preferences in a new market you haven't been in, with product that might not be preferred by the consumers?
South Africans have been very critical about government's response to the US tariffs and our stance, which has been very diplomatic, behind the scenes, which is the way President Ramaphosa and his cabinet deemed it best, as opposed to the US. Donald Trump, it was a tweet a day, a social media post per day. She's clearly laid out South Africans' response strategies, and I'm wondering what your view is on it, Kenzie, and how has it been in terms of implementation? Has it been easy? Has it been difficult? What's your take?
We had the opportunity to visit some of our producers and exporters in the Western Cape, and I have to say that I commend their resilience and their attitude towards this. While they are expressing uncertainty, they're expressing the fact that, it is going to be a difficult and a learning curve. We have seen numbers in exports really rising in the first quarter and the second quarter of the year. So they really took that opportunity. They really increased those exports to those markets. So their response was quite nimble. And I do agree with Zama. The strategy of market expansion might take a little bit more time, and it will require a lot more work, but we are open to those diversification strategies going forward always. So I would just say that the industry is not taking this laying down. They are moving quite nimble and are proving to be resilient.
And it's the one thing that South Africans are known for. There's even that expression, a farmer makes a plan, a boer maak 'n plan. It reminds me of that vasbyt factor, the resilience factor. And as we know in South Africa, with every challenge comes maybe opportunities. Are there even opportunities that we are unlocking or should be unlocking, Salo?
Yeah. So two in the main, right? At least in my mind. So on an outward-looking basis, there is a market out there. There is a market in the EU. There is a market within BRICS. And most importantly, I think there is a market in Africa. Okay. So if you look at the Africa Trade Agreement, it's been underwhelming. So there hasn't been a lot of activity that's happening within African countries when it comes to trade. So I think this is an opportunity for SA to look at that, to actually really try to come together with other African leaders and see how they can expand trade within themselves. And then when you go overseas, in the European Union countries, yes, they are faced with challenges now, but that's a very robust economy. So when you look at, for example, within BRICS, there's a lot of opportunities there. Yes, China is going through challenges right now. Although their growth forecast is downwardly revised somewhat, but it's still above 4.5% in the medium term. So that's not nothing, right? And then when you look at, one of the countries that we can really find opportunities in within BRICS that's doing quite well, at least from a consumer perspective, is India. So there lies opportunities. But my learned colleagues here are more experts in that space. But I want to also bring it closer to home, right? To say, Zama mentioned something that's quite interesting here, that competition rules relaxed, okay, so that farmers can collaborate and touch weather the storm. This is not something new, okay. So if you remember when we had a logistics issue in SM, this also happened. And what it goes to show is that when there's difficulty, the conversation that we've been having, at least as economists in SA, is to say we need to accelerate structural reforms. So what structural reforms help with is that if you think of the cost of doing business, they lower the cost of doing business. That's where your competitiveness comes in. I mean, it's all there for everybody to see and everybody to know, because it's public information that, for example, South Africa's ports are ranked among the last out of 350, somewhere there. So there are opportunities for us as a country to look within, right? Try to lower the cost of doing business and ultimately help not just the agri sector, but the economy as a whole.
I love how economists always are cautious. South Africa's ports are ranked among the last. As a journalist, I would say we suck. But South African production is expected to increase over time. But where are we taking it? European Union, you mentioned India, China?
During the first trade war, what we saw was that the trade disruption that happened between the giant of the importer and the producer that US is presented an opportunity for Southern Hemisphere producers such as Brazil. So that landscape completely or somewhat shifted in a significant manner that presented an opportunity for South Africa to take part in exports of soybeans. But then we didn't have protocols for exporting to China then. However, we quickly worked, as Silo mentions, we are quite nimble as a country. We changed the conversation. We seek solutions. So that protocol was signed, and then in 2023, we saw those exports rising to about 150,000 tons of soybeans went out. So there lies an opportunity for us, given the bumper crop for this year. And another market that we closely monitor is the EU, where South Africa previously had a significant share of exports, I think around 7%, that has came down, I think in 2024 was around 5.4. So we lost a little bit of market share there. But with what's happening between the US and Canada, with the US being a major exporter of premium wines to Canada, it presents us an opportunity to reclaim that market share because it's quite a sizable market. I think a $500,000 market, $500 million market. So it positions us better for seizing that opportunity. And I'm confident that the industry is in talks. The industry is making moves to see where that market can be capitalized. And maybe to just wrap up the India talk. So in one of our previous editions, I think it was the 2024 autumn edition, we did explore where growth comes, given where the Western economies are, given where the challenges in terms of Chinese growth. And we saw that India presents a demographic dividend with its population and its age. So there is an opportunity there, and the kind of consumption that they is rising rather. It's more of fruits. We can expand. It's not so much of a meat consumption market, but there is an opportunity for these high value exports. Given that markets are structured better, we are able to adjust to how they market in that region.
So Zama, maybe in closing, we have been talking about the European Union, China, India. our relationship with BRICS is very controversial, increasingly controversial. I know President Donald Trump has been clear that a friend of BRICS is not a friend of the US. Opportunities in SADC?
I'll start with the controversial topic of the BRICS. It's quite commodity dependent. So we do have, like Sila has mentioned, there is scope for us in specific commodities in terms of India as well as China, but the other BRICS countries, I think it's dependent on commodities as well as existing trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements rather. So I think it depends on the commodity. But there is opportunity in SADC. I think actually to expand it a little bit, I think Silo touched on it. There's more opportunities in Africa because it's more countries. It's not just the surrounding countries for South Africa. And I think it's a sweet and bitter relationship between us and our surrounding countries, right? So some commodities we're doing quite well, and then here or there we get slashed with some import ban. But I think if we can just have a round table talk, we could probably get some of those disagreements in alignment. But we need to understand that these countries are also a little bit inward looking. So they do try and protect their own economic activities by putting in restrictions where necessary in order to stimulate domestic growth. But I think with the situation looking at us like this, we might just have an expanded conversation to see how we can weather the storm as a collective.
And that's the beauty of the ABSA Agri-Trends report. I guess that's the reason why it's become a bit of a Bible for the agricultural sector. It's quite hefty. So many people rely on it. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for helping us make sense of this new world order. And I want to encourage people to download the latest edition. It's the spring edition of ABSA's Agri-Trends report. It's now available on most platforms. And be on the lookout for the next conversation on the grain and oilseeds market and what that means for the sector and for you as a farmer.
That's it for this episode on how US tariffs and global uncertainty weigh on agricultural exports. Thank you to agricultural economist Zama Sangweni Kensani Mashimbi for sharing their expertise. For deeper coverage of ABSA's Agri-Trends report, head to Food from Zanzi's website. I'm Duncan Masua, and this has been Farmers Inside Track.